Widowed rancher needed a wife to keep his land, but the only one left was the cook girl with property burned into her arm. Coldwater, Wyoming, winter of 1876. Snow blanketed the prairie like a funeral shroud. The wind moaned through the cottonwoods, carrying with it the distant howl of a wolf. The moon hung pale over the Ward Ranch, its light tracing silver over the frost-glazed roof of the barn. Horses shifted in their stalls, hooves stamping against cold earth. Inside the kitchen, the fire snapped weakly, casting long shadows against worn walls that had seen too much silence. Gideon Ward stood stiffly by the table. The envelope from the Coldwater Bank opened and spread like a death sentence in his hand. He stared at the words again, already memorized, before folding the letter with the same tension one might fold a flag over a coffin. His shoulders were broad but burdened, his jaw set as if clenched against more than just the cold. Clara stood at the stove, her back to him, stirring a pot of rabbit stew. The scent of thyme and bone broth filled the room. Her long dark braid swung behind her as she moved. She did not look at him. Her sleeves were rolled just enough to reveal strength in her arms, but never high enough to show what lay above her elbow. He cleared his throat. Bank says I need a wife to keep this land. You're the only one left here, Clara. She did not turn, only paused the stirring for a breath, then continued. I'm your cook, not your bride, Mr. Ward. Find someone else. The clock on the wall ticked too loudly. Gideon stepped closer, stopping by the hearth. His voice softened, but not enough to hide the desperation beneath. There ain't anyone else. Not here. Not with snow coming and no roads open till spring. I got 30 days. After that, they take the deed. Now she turned. Her eyes, black as wet stone, met his with neither fear nor warmth, only caution. Her cheekbones were sharp beneath her sun-dark skin. Her lips were set in a line carved by years without safety. Why me? Because you're already here, and because I trust you with my boy. A long silence. The stew bubbled. Outside, a gust of wind rattled the window panes. Clara finally ladled soup into a bowl and set it on the table. Then she walked past him, her boots heavy on the floorboards, and opened the back door. The cold blasted in. She stepped outside into the snow, knee-deep, and knelt beside a pile of wood, tying it with a thin strip of worn leather. Gideon followed to the doorway, but didn't speak. She returned moments later, arms full of kindling, eyes unreadable. I don't take charity, she said, brushing past him. He nodded, not arguing. Instead, he reached behind the rocker by the hearth and pulled out a folded bundle. It was an old wool coat, navy blue, lined with lamb's wool, buttons tarnished. He laid it over the back of her chair. For the cold. Clara looked at it, not touching it. I've got my own, she said, but didn't move it away. From outside, faint voices carried through the wind. Laughter, then a muttered slur. Words. Marrying a Comanche now? They both heard it. Clara did not flinch, but her eyes flicked to the window. Her voice, when she spoke again, was steady. They'll burn your barn for that. I'll build another, he replied. She sat slowly. The fire cracked behind them. Gideon took a plate of cornbread from the table and placed it gently beside her bowl. She looked at it for a long while. Then, without a word, tore a piece, dipped it in the broth and ate. He sat across from her, elbows on the table. Their eyes met across the firelight. Clara swallowed, then whispered almost to herself, I'll think about it. Gideon nodded once, solemnly. That's enough for now. Outside, snow fell harder. The fire warmed the walls, and for a moment in that kitchen on the edge of nowhere, there was no war, no scars, no laws written to divide. Only two survivors waiting to see if they could build something out of ash. 3 days later, the wind had calmed, but the cold remained. Snow crunched beneath boots, and the sun skimmed low across the horizon, casting long shadows from the broken fence posts behind the Ward barn. Inside the kitchen, Clara moved silently, ladling porridge into a tin bowl, her braid tucked under a shawl. Amos giggled as he chased a moth near the fire, his small footsteps echoing off the wooden floor. Gideon had left early, or so Clara thought. She preferred it that way. Since his strange proposal, she had done her best to avoid lingering glances or too much quiet in the same room. She had not said yes. She had not said no, but she had stayed, and that was enough for now. Outside, she tied her shawl tighter and carried her tools to the fence line. Several rails had collapsed under the weight of the last snowstorm. She dropped to one knee and began the work. With practiced hands, she cut strips of rawhide and used a crisscross knot her grandfather had taught her before he was taken. Comanche knots were meant to last through storms and men. From the stable, Gideon watched her. The way she moved, quiet and efficient. She didn't waste strength. She didn't ask for help. Something about that made him ache and admire her all at once. He slung a bucket of water over his shoulder and crossed the snow to the horses. "They need you too," he said without looking at her. Clara didn't reply. She pulled the final strip tight and moved to the next post, but her eyes flicked toward him once, then away. Behind the rancher who needed a wife to keep. A man in a dark coat, the only one left, gelding slowed near the fence. Girl with property. His face was narrow, into her, beard trimmed, cold water, too clean for Wyoming winter of a bounty hunter, 1876, an enforcer. Snow blanketed the prairie like a funeral shroud. Just looped his reins over the post wind moaned and drew through the cottonwoods. He dragged it slowly across the howl of a wolf, leaving a shallow, pale over the Ward Ranch. Gideon stepped between him and Clara over the frost-glazed roof of the barn. The man smiled Horses thinly, shifted in their stalls, just admiring your property, Ward. Stamping against looks cold like the kind that won't be yours much longer. The fire nothing for sale here. Casting the man long shadows against worn walls that had seen too much silence. Clara stared at it, stood expression unreadable. The envelope from the Coldwater Bank was tucked into bed and spread like Clara returned from the barn with arms full of wood. He stared at the words again. Her fingers were red, already memorized, raw from the cold. Before folding the letter with the same tension, one might fold a flag sat over across the room. His shoulders were broad but burdened. When she placed a pot of soup on the table, as if clenched against more than just walked out without a word. Clara stood and returned minutes later carrying a hammer and a chisel. Stirring a pot of rabbit stew. In the glow of lantern light, the scent of time approached the old barn door. On the highest long dark braids just above behind her as she moved, he carved a small five-pointed star. Her sleeves were rolled just enough to reveal strength in her arms. Clara watched from the kitchen window, but never high enough to show when he finished. He stepped back. He cleared his throat. So you don't lose your wife to keep this land, he said quietly. You're the only one left. Clara rose before dawn. She did not turn. She boiled soup only and left the bowl stirring for a breath. A folded napkin beside it read in careful letters. Not your bride, for your board. By afternoon, someone else. The wind, the clock on the wall ticked. Gideon returned from town. Gideon stepped shoulder stiff, stopping by the hearth. The banker had sent another letter. His voice softened. This one curtain, not enough to hide the desperation inside the barn beneath. He paused. There ain't anyone else. By the saddle rack, not here. Hung not his wife's snow old coming coat. And no roads. It was no longer folded. It hung carefully on a peg. After that, the sleeves brushed clean. Now she collar repaired. Her eyes, Clara stood black as wet, trying it on. Met the navy with neither fear over her shoulders like only it belonged there. Her cheekbones were sharp beneath her sun. Their eyes met. Neither lips were set in a line carved by years without safety. There was no warmth in her gaze. Because you're already here. But there was no coldness because I trust you with only my something careful, something considering. The stew nodded once. Outside, she did not smile, but she did not rattled the window panes. Her posture straightened. Clara finally ladled soup hugging her like armor and set it on the table. She stepped past him slowly. Then she walked past him, boots sure her on boots the wooden heavy floor, on the floorboards, and for the first time in weeks, the back door. The barn did not feel quite so empty. She stepped outside. The sun had barely risen when Clara noticed the barn door ajar beside a pile of wood, and the stillness too tying it with a thin usual morning clatter of Amos. Gideon followed to the doorway. She called his name once, twice. She returned moments later. The wooden spoon slipped from her kindling and hit the floor. Eyes unreadable. Outside, I don't take charity. Snow led away from the porch, brushing past small, hurried. He nodded, not arguing. Clara grabbed her shawl. He reached behind the hunting knife beneath and pulled out a folded bundle. The woods were dense just past the ravine, navy blue, where tangled pines with lamb's wool, tall and silent, buttons tarnished. Her breath came in clouds. Over the back of branches her chair. Snapped beneath her boots. Clara looked at it, not touching it. Mama, I've got my own. Amos, she said. Clara sprinted, but didn't move it away. She found him cornered beneath a thicket. Faint voices carried through the wind. Terror, laughter. A thin trail of blood ran from his ankle where he had tripped. Marrying surrounding him now, were 3 wolves. They both heard low to the ground. Clara did not flinch. Bared, but her eyes
already
flicked
circling
to the window. Without hesitating,
Her voice,
when she
Clara
spoke again,
whistled.
was steady.
A sharp,
"They'll burn your
rising
barn
note,
for that." And
"I'll
threw a
build
handful
another,"
of snow at
he
the nearest
replied.
animal. She sat
They
slowly,
froze,
startled.
The fire
She
cracked
stepped
behind
between
them.
Amos and
Gideon
the wolves,
took a plate of
blade
cornbread
drawn
from the table
and
Stand
placed
slow.
it gently
Back.
beside her bowl. She
barked
looked
in
at it for a
Comanche.
long while.
The wolves hesitated.
Then, without a word,
One lunged,
tore a piece.
She slashed the
dipped
air,
it in the broth,
sharp
and
and
ate.
sure.
He sat across
Catching
from
its
her,
muzzle just enough to
elbows on the
startle it.
table. With a
Their
guttural
eyes
cry,
met across the
she
firelight.
grabbed a burning
Clara
branch from a
swallowed,
fallen tree nearby
then whispered
and waved
almost
it
to
wildly.
herself.
The fire
"I'll
hissed.
think about it."
The wolves
Gideon
scattered
nodded
into the
once,
brush,
solemnly.
growling as they
"That's
vanished
enough for
into the
now."
woods. Outside,
She knelt,
snow
heart
fell
pounding.
harder.
"You're
The
safe
fire
now,"
warmed the walls,
she whispered,
and for a moment
wrapping
in that
Amos
kitchen
in her
on
shawl.
the edge of nowhere,
Blood soaked through
there
his
was
sock,
no war,
but he was
no
breathing.
scars, no laws
His small
written to
hands
divide.
clung to her
Only
tightly,
two survivors
his
waiting
face
to
buried
see if
against
they
her.
could build something
Gideon
out of
arrived
ash.
moments later,
3 days later,
rifle in hand.
the wind had calmed,
eyes wild,
but the cold
Amos.
remained.
Clara
Snow
stood
crunched
holding
beneath
the
boots,
boy,
and
I
the sun
found him.
skimmed low
Gideon
across the
ran
horizon,
forward,
casting
taking
the
the
long
boy
shadows
into his
on the
arms.
broken fence
He
posts
froze when
behind
he
the
saw
ward
Clara's
barn.
torn sleeve.
Inside the kitchen,
The frayed fabric
Clara
had pulled
moved
back,
silently,
revealing a raw,
ladling porridge into a
discolored
tin
scar
bowl,
burned deep
her
into the
braids
skin
tucked
under
under
her
a
shawl.
arm. Amos giggled as he
AWRD.
chased a moth near
The
the
letters
fire.
were crooked,
His small
as if
footsteps
seared by a
echoing
hand
off
untrained
the wooden
but
floor.
intentional.
Gideon had
ugly,
left early,
permanent.
or so Clara
God.
thought. She
His
preferred
voice
it
cracked.
that way.
Who did
Since
that
his
to
strange
you?
proposal,
Clara pulled her
she had
shawl
done her
back up
best
slowly,
to avoid lingering
her eyes met
glances
his,
or too much
not
quiet
angry,
in the same
not
room.
ashamed.
She had not
I
said
survived.
yes. She had not said
simply.
no, but she
He
had
didn't
stayed,
speak,
and that was enough
didn't
for
move.
now.
Outside,
Just looked at her as if
she
seeing
tied
her
her
for the
shawl
first time.
tighter and carried
That
her
night,
tools to the
whispers
fence
circled
line.
through town.
Several
A
rails
ranch
had
hand
collapsed
claimed
under
Clara
the
had
weight
fought
of the
off a
last
pack of
snowstorm.
wolves with nothing
She
but a
dropped
knife
to one
and
knee
fire.
and began the
Someone
work.
else claimed
With
she
practiced
carried scars
hands,
from her time
she cut
as a
strips of
Comanche
rawhide
captive and used to
Someone else
crisscross
said
not
she
her
had
grandfather
magic.
had taught her
She's
before
dangerous.
he was taken.
Comanche
They murmured,
knots were meant
"She's
to
not
last
natural.
through storms and men.
She was property
From the
once."
stable,
She
Gideon
could
watched
turn
her.
on him.
The way she moved, quiet and efficient. She didn't waste strength. She didn't ask for help. Something about that made him ache and admire her all at once. He slung a bucket of water over his shoulder and crossed the snow to the horses. "They need you too," he said without looking at her. Clara didn't reply. She pulled the final strip tight and moved to the next post, but her eyes flicked toward him once, then away. Back at the ranch, Clara sat quietly by the fire, carving a small wooden charm. Her hands trembled only slightly. Her knife moved carefully, forming the delicate curves of a wolf's head. She hung it on the gate post at the front of the property, just above where Amos's hand would reach. Gideon watched from the barn. Later that night, he walked into the kitchen and placed a folded handkerchief on the edge of her bedroll. "For your hands," he murmured. She looked at it, then at him. A pause. Then she nodded barely. The next morning, he found the fence post near the boy's favorite path marked with shallow carvings, spirals and arrows, protective symbols from her people. Beneath them, her initials small and steady. For Amos. That night, as the wind carried distant howls across the hills, Gideon stood beside her beneath the moon. She didn't move away when he came near. "You are more than a cook," he said, his voice low. She didn't reply, but she turned her head slowly and their eyes met, uncertain, unguarded for the first time. She didn't smile, but she didn't look away either. The papers were signed in silence. No church, no vows, no witnesses but the wind scraping across the windows. Gideon and Clara sat opposite the county clerk in Coldwater, a man who did not look them in the eye as he stamped the seal. Afterward, they rode back in the wagon together. Amos slept curled under a blanket in the back, unaware that his father had just taken a wife, or that the woman who stirred his soup every evening now carried his family name. Inside the kitchen that night, Clara moved with quiet grace. She stirred a pot of soup with one hand while showing Amos how to start a flame with flint and dried grass. He clapped with excitement when the first sparks caught. "You remember the 3 breaths," Clara said softly. "Not too fast. The fire needs to trust you." Gideon watched from the doorway, arms folded, leaning against the frame. A strange warmth filled his chest, something like pride, something like home. But peace was fleeting in Coldwater. The next day, just before dusk, smoke coiled into the sky behind the barn.
Gideon ran first, rifle in hand. Clara followed with a bucket. Flames licked the hay pile stacked by the fence, small but hungry. A broken lantern lay nearby. The same knife groove from days ago now had black scorch marks beside it. The fire was controlled quickly, Gideon smothering the base with his coat, Clara flinging water with practiced force. Their hands met once on the bucket handle, fingers brushing through steam and soot. Neither pulled away. When it was over, the barn stood, but just barely. Gideon cursed under his breath. He said he'd do it, he growled. Said he'd burn what he could not buy. Clara looked toward the town. Will he come back? Gideon nodded. If the bank keeps pushing, yes. Clara wrapped her arms around herself. Later, in the quiet of the evening, Gideon laid a bundle beside her bedroll. It was a thin strip of fresh leather. She touched it gently. You made this. Cut it from the last good saddle strap. She nodded once, a gesture of thanks not quite spoken aloud. The next morning, Gideon found a small plate on his workbench in the barn, still warm, covered by a cloth. Beneath it, a wedge of cornbread, buttered and golden. A note, scribbled in careful letters, for your heart. That night, Clara stood near the hearth, her hands idle for once. You want to know how I got the scar? She said, voice low. Gideon turned from the window. I figured you'd tell me when you were ready. She nodded slowly. I was 13. My village was raided in the dark. They didn't ask questions, just took what they wanted. Horses, blankets, children. I was small, strong, easy to move. They sold me to a man near the Texas border. He branded me after I ran once. She pulled back her sleeve just enough to reveal the raised, burned letters. He called me girl, never by name. When he died, the others passed me around until I found a way to run for good. Her voice shook. Some days I still smell the iron. Gideon crossed the room slowly. He reached for her hand. She flinched, then let him. You're no one's property, he said firmly. Not now. Not ever again. Her fingers tightened around his, and then to his surprise, she began to cry. Quiet, fierce tears that ran without sound down her cheeks. He said nothing more, just stood with her as the firelight flickered and the storm outside gathered in the distance. Clara knelt beside the hearth, humming a soft tune from her lips as she stirred the stew. Amos sat cross-legged at her feet, mimicking the rhythm. His small voice carried the melody she had taught him, an old Comanche lullaby shaped by wind and memory. Again? He asked, beaming. She nodded. One more time, but slower this time. Let the song breathe. Outside, Gideon hammered a new brace to the barn door. His sleeves were rolled, jaw set in quiet focus. Each blow of the hammer echoed like a heartbeat across the open yard. Behind him, the scar from the fire still blackened part of the fence, a reminder of how close they'd come. But his mind was elsewhere. He had received word that the bank was sending someone, an attorney, to verify the legitimacy of the marriage. It wasn't enough to have signed papers. They wanted proof, witness, conviction. Gideon stood by the workshop table that night, pen in hand. By lantern light, he began to write. To whom it may concern, I, Gideon Ward, declare Clara Ward not only my lawful wife, but the woman who holds this land together. The words were halting at first, then steadier. He wrote not for bureaucracy, but for truth, for himself, for her. Unseen by him, Clara stood at the edge of the doorway, watching. She said nothing, but her eyes lingered on the curve of his handwriting, the way his brow furrowed with care. Something shifted in her then, less like a falling and more like a soft, steady settling, like coming home. The next morning, she found the frame of the front door sanded clean with fresh chisel marks just above the latch. Clara was etched in block letters. He passed by as she was tracing the carving with her fingers. For my wife, he said simply and walked on. She didn't follow. But later, while Amos napped, she took one of the leather cords he liked to play with, tied it into a small loop, and hung it gently around his neck. For our boy, she whispered, brushing his hair back. When the lawyer arrived, he came not alone.
The same bounty hunter rode behind him, arms crossed, lips curled in that half-smile Clara had come to dread. Gideon met them at the gate. The lawyer adjusted his gloves. "We'll need a few words, Mr. Ward, about your arrangement." Gideon didn't waver. "There's no arrangement. Clara is my wife." The man raised a brow. Convenient timing. Gideon stepped aside, gesturing toward the porch. Clara emerged, holding Amos by the hand. Her braid hung long over her shoulder, and her gaze was steady. Gideon turned to her, then took her hand gently. "She's not here for land," he said, voice low but firm. "She's here because she's the only part of this place that still feels like home." Clara looked at him, eyes wide, not in fear, but something close to awe. She squeezed his hand. The lawyer cleared his throat. "Is this what you want, ma'am?" Clara lifted her chin. "I chose this home. I chose him." There was silence. Then the lawyer nodded, scribbled a note in his ledger, and motioned for the rider to leave him behind. Later, as the sun dipped low, casting the ranch in copper light, Gideon stood beside Clara on the porch. Neither spoke, but the land felt quieter, less burdened, as if the wind had finally decided to leave them alone. The fire started just after sundown. Gideon smelled the smoke first, sharp and bitter, not like hearthwood. Then came Amos' cry from the kitchen. "Fire!" He ran for the door, rifle already in hand, heart pounding as he saw the south fence ablaze, flames dancing in a cruel line across the dry posts. Behind them, shadows moved fast and mounted, retreating toward the road. One rider lingered long enough to toss a match and sneer. Clara was faster than him. She tore past the porch, her braid flying behind her, a pail of water in each hand. No fear, no hesitation. She dropped to her knees at the edge of the flames, scooping snow and dirt in practiced movements. Her voice rose in sharp commands, words in Comanche he had never heard clearly. She moved like someone born in fire. Gideon joined her, slamming down buckets, tearing a blanket from the laundry line, and beating the flames. Behind them, neighbors arrived, some on horseback, some with shovels. Townsfolk who days ago would not meet Clara's eyes now stood shoulder to shoulder, stamping flames beneath heavy boots. Together, they fought the fire back. When it was done, Clara stood alone in the field, smoke curling around her. Her dress was singed, her hands blackened with ash, but she stood tall, chest rising with slow, measured breaths. Gideon walked to her side, his blood still hot with fury. The bounty hunter stood at the edge of the fence, arms crossed, his expression smug. "You'll lose more than fences if you keep hiding behind her." Gideon stepped forward, rifle raised, not aimed, not yet, but close. "You set one more flame on my land, and you won't ride out again." The man spat, then turned his horse and rode hard into the night. When it was quiet again, the townsfolk lingered. One woman stepped forward, placing a bucket at Clara's feet. "You're braver than most of us," she said. Clara looked at her, unsure, but the woman nodded. "We see it now." That night, Clara sat near the hearth, mending Gideon's shirt. Her fingers moved slowly over the worn fabric, patching it with soft blue cloth. She folded it neatly and placed it at the foot of his bedroll. "For your warmth," she wrote on a small slip of paper tucked inside the collar. Upstairs, on the small table beside her bed, Gideon had left a jar of wild flowers, dried, but still holding color. "For our home," the note read. Later, as the moon rose high, casting silver across the land, Clara stepped outside. She wore no shawl. The scar on her arm, burned and raised, was bare in the moonlight. The townsfolk had gathered by the fence, waiting. She stepped forward, her heart pounding. "I was once a possession," she said. "Branded like cattle, passed between men like coin." She paused. "But I survived. I am not property. I am not shame. I am a woman, and this land is my choice." A hush followed. Then, one by one, heads nodded. Someone clapped. Others followed. Gideon moved to her side. Wordless, he wrapped an arm around her,
pulling her close. "You're not my possession," he whispered. "You're my home." She closed her eyes, resting her forehead against his shoulder. And under the moonlight, in front of strangers who now understood, they stood together. No longer cook and rancher, no longer runaway and widower, but something else entirely, something whole. The snow melted slowly that year, retreating like a tired soldier. By early April, soft shoots of green broke through the hard-packed earth near the porch. Clara was the first to rise each morning, knees in the dirt, hands guiding seeds into the ground. Carrots, onions, squash. She moved with quiet purpose, sleeves rolled, hair loose under the warming sun. Gideon watched her from the porch, hammer in hand. He was building a rocking chair from leftover oak, smoothing each edge as if shaping more than wood. By late afternoon, the frame was done. He placed it facing east, where the sun touched the fence line first. The seat creaked as he tested it. It held. Amos ran past them both, barefoot and shrieking with joy. "Ma! Come see the lizard." Clara looked up, brushing soil from her fingers. "What kind?" "A fast one." She smiled and followed. Gideon's eyes lingered on the way Amos grabbed her hand without a second thought, as if it had always belonged there. Later that week, townsfolk began arriving in twos and threes. A sack of flour, a spool of thread, a handmade shawl stitched with red blossoms. "For the bride," they said shyly, offering the gifts. Clara accepted them all with a nod and a small smile, her shoulders no longer tense, her gaze no longer guarded. The fence had burned, but the wall between her and the town had fallen, too. The wedding came with no announcement, no priest, just a circle of friends by the river behind the barn, the trees budding pale green. Clara wore a dress she had sewn herself, simple cotton tied with a leather sash. Gideon wore his best shirt, still patched where she had mended it months ago. Amos stood between them, holding both their hands. A friend from town read a blessing, and they exchanged words meant not for ceremony but for truth. "I saw you," Gideon said, his voice low. "Not when you came here, but when you stayed." Clara's voice didn't tremble. "You gave me a name I chose, not one I had to survive." They kissed, soft and unhurried, as the river sang behind them. That night, Clara placed a thin strip of braided leather over the back of the new porch chair. A small carving marked its center, 3 lines intertwined, the Comanche symbol for family. "For our family," the tag read. Gideon found it at dawn. He didn't say a word, just sat in the chair, his hands on the leather, and breathed. Later, as Clara passed, he reached for her hand. "You're my land," he whispered. "The only thing I'd fight to keep." She smiled then, full and bright. That night, under a moon swollen with spring, they laughed. Really laughed for the first time, not because the past was gone, but because it had finally found its place behind them. A horse neighed in the distance. The wind picked up, but it was warm, and the porch light stayed on long after they'd gone inside. By midsummer, the ranch had settled into a kind of peace neither Clara nor Gideon had ever truly believed possible. The silence between them was no longer heavy with hesitation or grief. It was soft now, lived in, the kind of quiet that comes only when the worst has passed and there is nothing left but to grow. The fields, once bare and brittle from winter's grip, now stretched wide with deep green. Wheat waved gently in the breeze, and new corn pushed stubbornly through dark soil. The fences had been rebuilt, not just repaired, stronger this time, with railings driven deep and posts sealed with care. Each board held the memory of effort shared between neighbors. Strangers who had once looked at Clara with suspicion now greeted her with nods, warm bread, and laughter. The house, too, had changed. The paint had faded in places, but there was pride in every plank. Clara had woven a windcheam from bones, feathers, and copper she found by the river and hung it beside the porch door. Its sound was not loud, but when the breeze picked up, it filled the air with something old and sacred. Along the path to the barn, she had planted wildflowers. Blues like the deepest part of the sky, gold like prairie fire, purples as soft as bruised petals. They grew tangled and free, not in neat rows, but in glorious disorder, the way her memories of childhood had bloomed. Amos called them Mama's colors and picked bouquets every morning, leaving them in unexpected places. On her pillow, in Gideon's boot, by the water pail. Above the front gate, Gideon had carved a new sign from thick cedar. The letters were bold, sure, and clean, carved deep into the thick cedar plank with a craftsman's precision. Ward Haven. Gideon had spent the morning on it, his large hands moving with a practiced grace that had once been reserved for repairing fences and saddling horses. Beside the name, he'd etched a 5-pointed star. It was the same shape he had once carved above the barn door in the dead of winter, a quiet prayer for direction when Clara was still just a cook with guarded eyes and he a man buried in silence. That star had been a temporary mark of faith. Now it was a permanent sign of arrival. He wiped the last wood shavings from the sign and stood it proudly above the front gate. This wasn't just his land anymore. This was a place for their family to call home. That morning, Clara stood by the kitchen window, sunlight painting soft, golden shapes across the worn wooden floor. In her hands, she held a quilt stitched not only with thread but with time. It bore the symbols of her people. Horses that ran with the wind, suns that never set, rivers that remembered every turn and bend. Each square was a part of her journey, a patchwork of survival and memory. At its corner, she tied a small leather tag with a single word etched on it. Son. She placed the quilt gently on Amos's bed, a silent legacy woven for the boy who had brought them all together. Later that afternoon, a wagon rolled up the road from Coldwater. The lawyer stepped out, this time not with caution and judgment, but with a certificate in hand, legal, final, and true. He unrolled the document with a flourish. The land was theirs. The marriage was recognized. The threat of losing everything had finally vanished. Word spread fast, and by dusk, the porch was filled with neighbors. The very people who had once whispered rumors now came with offerings of welcome. Someone passed a jug of warm cider. Children ran barefoot through the yard, their laughter a sound that had been absent from the ranch for too long. Clara's cornbread vanished from the table in minutes, and someone, a woman who had once been among the first to turn her back, shyly asked for the recipe. As twilight fell, painting the sky in shades of bruised purple and fiery orange, Clara stepped forward. She wore the same simple cotton dress she had stitched for their riverside wedding. The wind tugged gently at her braid as she faced the crowd, her heart pounding with a different kind of courage. Without fanfare, she reached for her sleeve and pulled it back, her arm bare in the fading light. The scar, dark and brutal, ran across her upper arm. It had once branded her less than human, a thing to be owned, a past to be hidden. But now, she bore it openly, a testament to her endurance. This scar, she said, her voice steady and clear, is my story, and it brought me home. For a moment, there was only the sound of wind through the rustling wheat. Then one hand clapped, then another, and then the porch and yard filled with a thunderous applause. It was not pity, not curiosity, it was honor. Gideon walked to her, his gaze locked on hers. He took her hand and gently touched the scar with his thumb, a wordless gesture of acceptance. "You're not my possession," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "You're my home." She closed her eyes, resting her forehead against his shoulder. And under the moonlight, in front of strangers who now understood, they stood together, no longer cook and rancher, no longer runaway and widower, but something else entirely. A family, whole and unbreakable. This closing is already powerful. It feels like both the end of Clara and Gideon's arc and the narrator's farewell to the audience. If you'd like, I can expand and elevate it into something more cinematic and emotionally layered, while keeping the spirit of a Wild West love story outro. Here's a rewritten and lengthened version. The marriage was recognized at last. There would be no more riders on the horizon, no more whispered threats in the night. Word traveled faster than the creek water in spring. and by dusk the porch was crowded with neighbors come to witness, to eat, and to lay old grudges to rest. Someone passed a jug of cider from hand to hand. Barefoot children darted through the yard, chasing fireflies and laughter in equal measure. Clara's cornbread vanished from the table before the second tray could cool, and voices rose asking her for the recipe. For the first time, her name was spoken not with suspicion, but with warmth. As twilight deepened, Clara stepped forward. She wore the same simple cotton dress she had stitched with her own hands for the riverside wedding. The hem brushed against her ankles as the evening breeze tugged gently at her braid. The crowd hushed, their faces turned toward her. Without fanfare, she rolled back her sleeve. Gasps caught in a few throats, though no words came. The scar, long and brutal, stretched across her upper arm. Once it had marked her as something less than human, a possession, a body claimed by cruelty. She had hidden it for years, ashamed, silenced. But now she bore it openly, as if the scar itself were a banner. "This mark," Clara said, her voice even, "is not my shame. It is my story, and it brought me home." The silence that followed was not heavy but holy. The only sound was the soft rustle of wheat in the fields. Then a single clap rang out. Another followed, and then the whole porch thundered with applause. But it was not pity they offered, nor idle curiosity. It was respect. It was honor. Gideon came to her, his steps slow, deliberate, the lamplight brushing his weathered face. He took her hand, lifted her scarred arm gently, and pressed his thumb to the mark. His voice dropped low, meant for her but carried to all who listened. "Her home," he whispered. Later, when the neighbors had gone and the night spread wide, Clara and Gideon stood together in the open field. The summer air hummed warm and alive. Wildflowers bent and swayed like dancers to the rhythm of the breeze. Overhead, the stars burned clear and sharp, scattered across the heavens like grains of salt. The moon spread silver across the land they had bled and prayed for, not conquered with bullets, but won with bravery and love. "You tamed my heart," Gideon murmured, his lips brushing her temple. Clara pressed closer, resting her face against him, her voice soft as a prayer. "No," she breathed. "We found it together." From deep in the timber, a wolf howled, low, long, and unafraid. Not a warning this time, but a song. And above the wooden gate, the carved sign caught the moonlight. Ward Haven, a home built not on power or fear, but on love. And so their story settles into the soil of the plains, a testament to the truth that even in a land scarred by war, prejudice, and fire, love can take root. Not in spite of our wounds, but because of them. If Clara and Gideon's journey stirred something in you, a tear, a sigh, or a memory of what it means to finally belong, don't forget to subscribe to Wild West Love Stories. Each week we bring you a tale carved from dust, danger, and devotion. Hit the bell so you'll never miss a romance where bullets missed, but hearts never did. Until next time, partner. Ride safe. Love wild.